Um, okay, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to our fourth presentation in our conference online series of weekly talks, The Case for Open Borders. We've already done three. They're on our website at fff.org. This one is you're in for a real special treat. John Washington is an investigative reporter for a newspaper out in Tucson called Luminaria. And it's not his only job. He does other projects as well. But he's been published widely. He actually got an award from an organization called the Institute for Nonprofit News for a series that he did on deaths at the Pima County Jail. He's written widely. Again, gotten published widely in the Washington Post, The Intercept, Atlantic, The Nation, other outlets. His first book was called The Dispossessed, A Story of Asylum at the U.S.-Mexico Border and Beyond. That was published in 2020 by Verso Books. But his greatest book, in my opinion, is The Case for Open Borders. When I discovered this book, I was fascinated. It's one of the best books you will ever buy that makes the case for open borders. I mean, you read this book, and I'm almost certain you will become an advocate of open borders. It's fantastic. Let me just read you three of the comments on Amazon. A powerful and convincing case for human solidarity and cooperation for which John Washington provides a roadmap. Second, John Washington provides us with an essential evidence-based, politically sophisticated, and ethically compelling tool to address one of the most important issues of our time. Third, perhaps the most profound book you'll read this year. So it is a real honor and a real pleasure to have you here with us, John. Thank you for taking the time to add to our collection of great presentations on this vitally and critically important issue of immigration and specifically open borders. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Jacob. That was a, a humbling introduction, and I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the invite and all your work, and thanks to folks for being here. I was telling Jacob just before we started that I lament that I haven't been able to attend any of the other presentations so far. I hope to attend a couple upcoming ones, but yeah, my work as a reporter and this election cycle has just kept me buried. And so what I want to do is, I know some of the other people who have presented, or know their work at least, and they do just absolutely excellent work, and I leaned on it in my own book. And so I want to give a little bit more of a personal or reported approach to open borders and this idea of bordering and how borders impact people, especially knowing like I probably have read and so many of the articles that Kaplan has put out, and I just can't stand up next to him in the way that he understands the metrics and economics of this, but have been very happy to use him as a source many times. So I'll start with telling you all a little bit about how I came to writing about this in the first place, and then just kind of walk through some of the reporting that I've done and some of how that's driven my approach to this. So I grew up hearing about borders. My mother was a migrant. She escaped from Romania in the 1960s as a teenager with her parents and her brother. And so I grew up in a Romanian American community in Ohio, and we had all sorts of people who of mixed status who talked about how they got out of Romania, and they would tell stories about things like hiding in train compartments or swimming across rivers and doing all they could to try to, find freedom or find opportunity. And I sort of, as a kid, I thought that those stories were something of some distant past, like this black and white era, of like this Soviet era, and I didn't realize that that was still happening today. It seemed like, of course, we have triumphed. Human progress has gotten beyond such a system that would drive people to do such a thing. But as I started to come of political age, I was truly sort of shocked to learn the reality of how people are forced to migrate still. And that was in part what drove me out first to California, to Southern California, and then to where I am now, Arizona, and to begin trying to understand and report on and write from borders throughout the world, mostly in this hemisphere, but not exclusively. You know, I've spent a lot of time in different parts of Mexico on the migrant trails in Central America. And you know, it wasn't just sort of the dawning realization or like coming to finding news outlets that were able to sort of explain the reality of what was going on, but a couple really impacting experiences. And one of which was I was still quite young and still trying to learn about all this stuff. And I was out with a buddy. We were going to go for a few nights of camping out in the Anza Borrego Desert in just east of San Diego in Southern California. And we were driving to our campsite and we saw a young man by the side of the road and he flagged us down. And he was, at that point, I didn't speak Spanish. I've come to speak Spanish and also do work as a translator now. But at that point, I was very rusty. And so we had some struggle to communicate back and forth, but he let it be known that he had walked a long way, that he was, yeah, my guess is late teens, early 20s, probably from southern Mexico or maybe Central America. And he was in bad shape. So we gave him some water right away, and he drank that, and we refilled him, and we gave him a couple oranges that we had. And he was sort of letting us know that he wanted to get a ride to the next town, which was 20 so miles away across this desert. And we were just like, oh, I don't know. I don't think that's possible. I don't think we could do that. And so we didn't. We wished him luck. We gave him a couple more oranges. We made sure his water bottle was full. And we drove away. And 20, 30 minutes later, we got to where we were planning on camping and we started unloading our stuff. And I just kind of came to me. I was like, what did we just do? We just left this kid by the side of the road. He was in like not good shape. I mean, he could still walk and he's clear eyed, but you could see his skin was like very sun worn and his clothes were rather tattered. And I kind of was shaken out of this weird mindset and said, all right, we got to go back and find him, of course. And so we drove back and we didn't find him. If anyone who spent any time in this region knows that, you can walk for a minute and not have any line of sight on anyone and be completely lost if you don't have your bearings. We drove up and down the road a couple times, calling out, we stopped, we called out, and we didn't find him. And it wasn't that exact moment, but there was a sort of a slow dawning realization that began then, where I recognized that the way that society has constructed borders had so deeply influenced me that it changed the way that I interacted with other human beings to such a degree that I was willing to leave somebody by the side of the road who needed help. And I was willing to just go on about my business. And I also realized that I don't want to treat people like that. I don't want that to be the way that I interact with other human beings. And there's a word that I learned later on that I think applies to this, and it's the German word Mauerkrankheit, which means wall sickness. And it came out of the era during when there was the Berlin Wall cleaving into East and West Germany, and how it would inflect so much of the way that people would think about people on the other side and just go about their daily lives. It just got so deep into their psyche that it changed the way that they were. And I think that on basic principle that this is something that is often forgotten when we talk about borders and immigration. There is so much use and misuse of this idea of borders or this idea of immigration, of how immigration is happening or how it works, that just is like fire hosing, especially right now, out of politicians' mouths, out of policymakers. And there is I think, such an incredible disconnect between how it's talked about and the reality. And one thing that is forgotten is this basic idea of principle, of how our system affects people. So right now, there are billions of people throughout the world who do not enjoy the same freedoms and the same right, the right of free movement, as I have. And this is something that somehow we have learned, I think, through what, and I can talk a little bit more about how the border actually not only impacts us, but impacts the way that we understand the border even. We don't recognize that this incredible disparity, that I can, traipse either direction back and forth this border, which I live very near, and there are all these people who, for the mere fact of being born on the other side of the line, can be hunted down by border guards, who can face long-term detention, which includes, a privation of a whole host of other rights, which includes sometimes torture, which includes sometimes indefinite detention, and then something like excommunication or deportation. And that disparity between the basic rights is something that I think should be forefronted at every conversation about borders and immigration. You know, the society has, over the past century or so, taken strides. Not that we haven't completely achieved this, but we've taken strides to eliminate discriminations based on national, or sorry, not national, to eliminate discriminations based on religion, based on gender, based on sex, based on race. And we have left aside this other immutable characteristic, which is where you are born. And but for that thing of which you have no control, you can be lawfully discriminated against in a whole host of ways. And I think that that is something that is where I like to start the conversation, just like remind folks of where we are. Um, and when I do that, a lot of people, making presentations or talking about my book or just talking about borders, a lot of people will be nodding their heads and then all of a sudden stop nodding their heads and be like, yeah. And then there's this knee-jerk response, which is, well, I agree with you. That seems unfair, but, like, let's think about the consequences. Because, like, if we were to open our gates any wider, there would be this flood of people. There would be this gobbling up of resources. There would be, a depletion of the Commonwealth. There would be like this run on all sorts of resources. And that fear has been implanted and harnessed and amplified and exaggerated. And yet, when you look at it, and this is something that I go to great lengths doing in my book, when you look at the evidence about, does this actually happen? Is this how things play out? You find that no, there's actually not evidence for that. And in fact, there's evidence to the contrary, that resources, because of the way that especially modern economies are structured, are not depleted, but they actually swell. And there's more resources, that the economy will grow, that more jobs will be added, that wages are not depleted. They're usually, remain stagnant or sometimes even go up a little bit. Again, like I refer you to people like Bryan Caplan, who get deep into that and who I, again, lean on in my book and elsewhere. So there are, all of these sort of counter arguments that I think are really essential to go through. But I think also there's a couple other key pieces of the conversation that often get left out, which is a couple of which I want to talk about right now. And this is something, when I was first really starting to do more serious reporting and research along the world's borders, I started noticing. And it was things like, like, borders don't seem to do a very good job of stopping people from moving. They don't work very well. And this is something that, it seems to be the case. But then once you start doing some research, and there are great, academics who have looked at these big number trends, you find that, yeah, that is actually the case. So you look at, the actual physical infrastructure that's built now on the U.S.-Mexico border. There's over 600 miles of it. Where I live now, most of Arizona, like overwhelmingly most of Arizona, is sealed off by bollard walls from the state of Sonora, just south of us. And the few parts that are not are incredibly mountainous, or have anyway all sorts of surveillance technology. And there's a number of very credible sources I have within the Border Patrol who tell me basically that nobody can get into Arizona from Sonora, outside of a port of entry, without them knowing about it. That doesn't mean they can respond to it, because they have limited manpower and resources to actually go and interdict someone who is going to build across, but they have blanketed southern Arizona with surveillance technology such that they know pretty much anyone who walks across. That, I think, itself should give us pause. That, I think, itself is worth stopping on and remembering that in the United States of America, there's that much surveillance that is happening. And of course, it's mostly directed outwards to people who are not born on this side of the line, but certainly that's not exclusive. And American citizens and people who are born here or who now reside here are also surveilled. So, you start noticing that people are able to get across. So we have this wall. Most of the wall is this 30-foot bollard wall now, constructed out of these, hollow steel cylinders filled mostly with concrete, and it's extraordinarily expensive, and it was very laborious to construct. And smugglers come through and they cut it with a saw that they can buy at Home Depot for $120. They can saw through it in a minute, and they do so all the time. And one of the things you frequently see when you travel along the border roads that the Border Patrol constructed along the wall is repair crews who are out with their acetylene torches and are repairing cuts in the wall. That is, you have a lot of job security if you're a welder in southern Arizona right now. So people get across, and they get across the wall in all sorts of inventive ways. They get across like rivers, if the rivers are part of the border. Of course, in southern Texas, that's the case. Or across the Mediterranean Sea. And whatever sort of technology or Coast Guard or border guard is thrown at smugglers or at migrants, they figure out some way to get through. And this is, the iron law of prohibition. That, there's an analogy to drug policy here, that you can crack down on trying on people using drugs or getting drugs, but they will find another way of getting them or another way of using them, or the drugs will, change in some different way. But, there's another piece of this besides just the border infrastructure. There's also immigration enforcement. And here there's something that I think, again, a lot of people sort of don't consider or don't keep in the conversation as well as they should. And this is going back to a number of policies. And the one that I want to look at now is something that I covered in my first book, with Jacob mentioned at the beginning, The Dispossessed. So I was reporting on asylum and trying to understand both the ancient origins of asylum policy, where in the world and when it first came into existence. And it turns out that basically, as long as there's been human societies, there's been some form, and some actually, if not codified, but sort of institutionalized form of accepting strangers in need. Go back to very early, civilizations. So I was trying to understand what happens with both the history of it, and then also what happens with people who are currently seeking asylum, and how after post-World War II, when we put all these asylum courts into a place, how those have been increasingly chipped away at and dismantled. I started reporting the book in the spring of 2018, which happened to be when the Trump family separation crisis was really put into effect. There's some iterations of it a couple of years before, but that was when they basically announced it. And so I was down in El Salvador and trying to find people who were either about to seek asylum, who had sought asylum and had been denied and deported. And yet like there was just this massive influx of foreign journalists in different parts of Central America trying to report on the family separation crisis. And so all of a sudden that became part of the story too. So this is like, you know, there was absolutely just, incredible international outcry about this incredibly inhumane policy, which was using the pain of sometimes infants or young children and their parents as a sort of deterrent strategy. And I profiled this young man. He was, I believe he was 26 at the time, Arnovis. He came from a very rural part of coastal El Salvador, and he got stuck between two gangs and through basically bad luck, started to be persecuted by both of them at the same time. And he knew what that meant because he had seen it happen to some distant relatives and some friends, and that was either forced recruitment and you join the gang, or you're dead. And he had this young child who he was a single parent of. She was 6 years old. Her name was Maybelline. And he took her and he traveled north through Mexico, an incredibly harrowing journey of which I don't have the time to share all the, I mean, truly grotesque details of what they went through, and made it to the border and crossed into the United States in South Texas. And this was in, I believe it was late April, early May of 2018. And they got taken into custody of the Border Patrol, and they said they were there to ask for asylum. They were there a couple days, and they were told then that they were going to be transferred to an ICE facility. And the border guard told Arnobi, said, look, we don't have room on this bus. We're going to send your daughter on this bus, and you're going to go on the next bus. But there was no next bus. So all of a sudden, he doesn't know where Maybelline is. She's gone. A couple days pass. He finally gets transferred to another ICE facility, to an ICE facility. And there the first thing he does is he asks, where's my daughter? And the guard told him, we didn't know you had a daughter. And he, made a stink, as he, to put it lightly, and demanded answers. And eventually a deportation officer told him, look, okay, yeah, we realize you do have a daughter, you crossed with a daughter. She's either in Florida or New York right now. And that wasn't much consolation to him, as you can imagine. Neither of which were true. She was actually in Phoenix at the time, not too far from where I am right now, in one of the facilities run by a for-profit company called Southwest Key. And some people may have that name in their heads because a couple months ago, the Department of Justice actually came out with a lawsuit suing Southwest Key and one other for-profit immigration detention sort of facilities slash child welfare organizations, so-called, because there was rampant abuse, including sexual abuse at a number of the facilities. So we don't know if Maybelline went through that, but we know that she was completely absent from her family and in zero communication with them for a little bit over a month. Eventually, Arnovis, through consulting with an attorney, realized that the best way to get his daughter back was to accept a deportation, even though he knew what he was facing back home. So he did that. Sort of long story short, she was eventually returned to him, and I ended up spending a lot of time together with the two of them and their extended family who were in hiding at that point in El Salvador. I walk us through this story, which is a tearjerker and is just absolutely devastating. If you have, especially if you have young children, you have a 4-year-old, can't tell it without just like feeling pangs. To say at the end that family is now in Kansas. I can't say that much more about where or how they got there, but even that didn't stop them from migrating. And if you look at the numbers, so zooming out from this sort of anecdotal piece of evidence, when you look at the numbers of family groups who are crossing the border, the US-Mexico border, from 2017 to about 2020, you saw that after 2018, that number did not drop. In fact, it went up a little bit. Even those sorts of enforcement measures do not work. And I think that's something that just gets so incredibly lost in the conversation. That's like, okay, so what are we doing here? If these border enforcement measures, these walls are as ineffective as is true. And you can keep on zooming out. You can look at really big picture numbers of like the percentage of the global population that's that's an international migrant who has crossed an international border has held steady for decades. The number of foreign-born population living in the United States is about 15% now. That's almost identical to what it was 100 years ago. That number may have actually ticked up a little bit this year. And then one sort of question that some people may have who follow this all closely is like, okay, yeah, so you've given some examples of these things about how they're not working. But like right now, isn't it kind of working? Because the numbers have dropped. So after unprecedented numbers, or probably unprecedented numbers, and I can kind of get into some of that too. I think that there may have been some over angsty calling out of how high the numbers were compared to early 2000s last December. But the numbers have dropped precipitously from December and January of last year to where we are right now. But like, let's remember, like, have people stopped moving? Have people stopped leaving their homes? The answer is no. People are now bottlenecked in Mexico, and this is something that I have done a lot of reporting on it in recent months, and I have a piece coming out hopefully in a couple days from New York Review of Books about exactly this. Is that people are there's a couple different ways that it's happening and how they're getting sort of trapped in Mexico right now. So one is that there's this form of almost like circular internal migration within Mexico where people are if almost like deported or pushed back from northern Mexico or central Mexico back to southern Mexico. Because the Mexican government doesn't have enough money to actually effect a deportation to Central America, to South America, or certainly not elsewhere. So they're just pushing people back down south, keeping them away from the US-Mexico border. Or they are stuck in northern Mexico, and this is where I've done most of my reporting, and they are waiting for this CBP-1 app to present their claim, to get an appointment to be able to present their claim for asylum. But let's just think about it. And this goes back to an earlier point I made about how much bordering has affected the way that we see the world, and has affected the way we even see the success of bordering, because a lot of people are hailing this as a success. But if you strip off the blinders of, native or nationalist ways of viewing the world, and you realize, oh, we haven't stopped migration. We've just sort of outsourced the problem a little bit. And we know by experience too that actually we have seen Mexico effectively in the past, effectively and temporarily slow down migration into the United States. But there's a lot of factors, and a lot of people who have spent, time studying this, decades studying this, really expect this not to last. There's, one of the factors is the US election, like what happens diplomatically if Trump gets back in office, what happens if Harris gets in office. We just had a change of administration in Mexico. We have yet to really see exactly how Claudia Sheinbaum is going to deal with this incoming US administration. And then there's all sorts of other factors that are at play here, including that the Mexican National Guard is going to be subsumed back into the military of Mexico, which was it was like broken off, and this new non-military controlled law enforcement agency was created about 6 years ago. A lot of that is going to affect what happens in Mexico. So we see this, people claim that we've been able to stop this. This is actually what the Harris campaign has been running on for the past couple months. But again, it's just like because their vision ends at the border. And their vision ends at the border. And this is something that I lean on the work of Jacqueline Stevens here, who's done really great work. She has a book called States Without Nations. And she calls borders not only the limits of, national territory, but also limits of empathy. And this goes back to my earlier point where I started this and how I came to be writing about this. It's like we don't see these people in the same way that we see people who have the same color passport as us. And I already mentioned, this idea of I left this person by the side of the road. I want to give a couple other examples of how this actually plays out. So this is something that just like it happens so frequently. It's something that you almost come to accept as just part of daily life, especially along the border's edge. How we respond to reports of human remains. So I've been investigating for the past couple of months response times to sightings of human remains. Most of the time in pretty remote rural parts of Arizona, South Texas, and New Mexico, California as well, uh, if the Border Patrol or activist organization or search and rescue, like civilian search and rescue organization, or some other just random person finds a set of human remains, finds a body, and they report it, sometimes it takes a really long time for any law enforcement agency to respond. Um, and I have collected reams of data now showing that, oh, we found this person, we found this, skeletal remains, or this decomposing body, or this freshly, dead person, and they call the sheriff's department. And the response times can be a couple days, a couple weeks, a couple months, or never. Imagine reporting a body in a city. Imagine reporting, the body of a U.S. citizen, a presumed U.S. citizen, basically anywhere in the United States, and it taking a couple of weeks for someone to get out, or to get out and recover that person, or never having that person be recovered. And the consequences for even just a short delay, a couple days, or especially a couple weeks, are profound. And what those consequences look like are possibly never being able to identify the person. You can only really successfully get fingerprints from a body, especially when they're out in the elements, within a couple months of the person dying. After that, you have to rely on DNA or some other sort of identifying factor, like an ID that happens to be in their pockets, but that's very often not the case. So what that translates into is families of people who knew that someone was going to migrate, knew that they were on the trip, and then just never hearing from them again. And I've talked to a number of people who are in that situation. They have an uncle, a dad, a brother who they have no idea what's happened. And this is in large part because of the way that we decide to respond to people who cross borders. Um, one of the things that I try to do, and I'll end in a couple of minutes and take some questions. One of the things that's also sort of motivated me to write this book is, I've laid out a handful of these, sob stories, whatever. I mean, I believe in them. I believe we should be sobbing about them. And a lot of people, I think, who can shake themselves out of a little bit this mode of looking at the world, who can kind of cure themselves from this Mauerkrankheit, from this wall sickness, say, yeah, that's awful, but I agree, that's bad. But I struggled for a long time in both reporting and then also, previously when I was doing more like activist work as well. It's like, all right, so yeah, so we're on the same page, it's bad, but like, what do we do about it? And there, I think, is this other gaping hole that we have in the conversation. I think the restrictionist, especially the restrictionist right, has dominated the conversation, increasingly so, for so long that there is no positive vision for what we want to do with borders in the world. All we have is like, that's bad. Trump, no good. And there's so many examples of, I mentioned the family separation crisis, this international outcry. I mentioned, or I didn't mention, but the Muslim ban, when that came down in 2017. People stormed the airports. They were so upset with it. Abolish ICE in 2018 became a hashtag. But where has that hashtag gone? Because maybe the worst of the abuses have been curtailed a little bit, but where does that leave us? We are still left with this system. And in fact, what we see, especially by the left, I mean, being like, the big D Democrats, for years, for decades now, has been to try to play the game of like, threading the needle between the centrist restrictionists or the right and the activists who, are claiming or, crying out decrying these abuses. But all we've seen is the conversation turn further and further and further to the right. At this point, the Kamala Harris her proposals for how we should respond to immigration is just further cracking down. And in fact, if you look at the initial policies that were proffered by in the first, few weeks by the Trump administration, in some regards, Kamala Harris is to the right of those. And I'm speaking specifically about asylum. Some of the things that she's not proposing a Muslim ban like Trump did. She's not proposing family separation, though that is a consequence of these border policies as we're seeing them now, and I can get into that. But in regards to asylum, that wasn't something that was so much on Trump's radar, at least not in his initial proposals. And that is exactly what the Harris campaign has been, celebrating how they've been gutting asylum protocols. And they want to do that even further. They want to bake that into law. So I just think like we have been playing people who are proponents of more liberal immigration or for open borders have just been playing defense. And one of the things I really wanted to do with this book is to lay out what a positive vision would look like and make the case for claiming it and proclaiming it. Because otherwise, we're just going to keep on just like falling down this slippery slope of like trying to play both sides and losing because fear, whatever. I mean, we could get into this too, but fear is such a great political campaign tool, and it's been harnessed successfully to keep on pushing us further to restrictionist policies. And I'll end on this note, which I wouldn't be surprised if some of your previous presenters have mentioned that, where we've come from in the past quarter of a century is from having about a dozen border walls to having at this, counting them exactly is a little bit tricky, but about 80. So we are accelerating right now in an era of immigration restrictions. And I think that part of the problem has been a narrative one. And we need to claim back this positive vision, this vision for the right to free movement. And yeah, I'll end there so we can have time for questions. But yeah, thanks for listening to me go on. And yeah, I hope we can chop it up a little bit here.
All right. Thank you, John. Great presentation. And thank you again for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. We've got a few questions, but I'm reluctant to present them to you because what I'd like y'all, if you're going to ask a question, to really address what we're talking about tonight. And so I'm not going to get into some of these. The first one compares some of the libertarian think tanks and foundations, and rather just stick with the concept of open borders. And then the second one makes a comment about Romania because that was where you were from, but I'd rather not get into the situation in Romania and just stick with the subject. And then the third one talks about discrimination as a basic right. Okay, but I want to stick with open borders and not get in sidetracked onto whether discrimination is a right or not. There's a couple of others, and just reluctant. If you got a question, this is more of a comment. The stories of separation abuses like kidnappings of migrant children was touched on at least one info article years ago, and then the commenter goes off on a very long sort of stream of thought with no
You know,
question.
Jacob, yeah, I'm seeing them too. I'm seeing that one in particular. And one thing that I didn't really get into, and maybe that question comment is sort of pointing it, but I think, one other thing worth mentioning here is opening borders is not a solution. And this is something that I talk about in the Dispossessed, in my book about asylum as well. And I think in some ways asylum is very much a solution to an individual, but it does nothing to address the initial root cause of why someone had to flee, the persecution that the person fled. I think open borders too, by themselves, is not an ultimate solution. I think it's actually going to be a huge help, and I think it will help clarify the need for a solution, the path towards a solution. But part of the huge actual solution is also fighting for the right to remain, and that addresses all of these sorts of world systems that we need to think about, which is maybe the other half of like, I don't know, Jacob, your like libertarian vision of, free markets or however you think you can better organize the market or just society in general, is to not make people leave. And right now, I mean, climate change is a huge one. Is ongoing war and instability, and so is economic predation. And I think, I think of uh, this idea where if people aren't given any real actual alternatives to these gross inequalities, both socioeconomic and class inequalities, then like of course they think that they're going to the only way to defend their way of living or their and any hope towards defending like the whatever the status quo is by building off these walls. And I think that it's really important, or building up these walls. I think it's really important to just remember that we need to think outside of the box, not just in the way that we guard the frontiers of a nation, but also why we feel we need to guard the frontiers of a nation. And that's something that I think also often gets lost. We don't talk about root causes, really, or at least not in a substantive way. So the fighting for the right to remain is really, I think, also a key portion. Not to be forced to remain, of course, but just the right to remain. So many people I've talked to, some of the migrants, even the ones who, had to flee in a hurry and went through just absolutely horrible things in their home countries, um, didn't really want to leave. Like they wished they wouldn't have had to have left. They wish they could have stayed. I mean, people get attached to a home. They drop roots. They know their culture and their neighbors and things like that. And there's some statistics that sort of show this as well. And like most international migrants don't travel very far. And I think it's something like 90%. I wish I had this number still. 90% of African refugees are in Africa right now. By far, overwhelmingly, the number of people who are having to leave their country in Africa are not going to Europe. A lot of them are, but most of them are going to the immediately neighboring country. And this is also happening in South America. So Venezuela has lost, between 6 and 8 million people in the past number of years. Most of them are in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. Now in the past year, there may be approaching like 1 million Venezuelans in the United States, but they're not all trying to come here. They like people are attached to their culture, and their culture is more similar the closer they are to home. So I think it just opening, and this also speaks to another sort of frequent response is that there would be overwhelming numbers of people who would all of a sudden come. And there's also been some interesting studies that have been done in this regard showing that, like, yeah, well, if you do this international survey of how many people would like to come to the United States if they could, and they go to like survey people in Central America, South America, different parts of the world, and the numbers are pretty high. But there have been also some studies that have shown that, okay, the number of people who can migrate, or the number of people who are able to match their desire to migrate with actually migrating is actually quite low. Because migration is expensive and it is unsettling and it completely changes your life. And though, of course, there is the draw for, different sorts of resources, different and other types of opportunities, people don't take the decision to actually flee very lightly. So I think that those numbers really wouldn't be nearly as high as some people fear.
Well, and your comment raises the issue of the contribution that the U.S. government makes to the incentive to leave. I mean, they aggravate the problem with the drug war, sanctions, embargoes like in Venezuela, the coups, the regime change operations, the support of tyranny. And then there's just this dark irony that when people flee these things that the U.S. is contributing to, people are not calling for a dismantling of those factors, but instead saying return those people where they're going to die.
Yeah. One of my colleagues and friends, Todd Miller, who's done some really great work on reporting about borders, he often has the quip about that the U.S. military has open borders. So we have, what, 800 some bases throughout the world. The U.S. military is in, so many different nations on every continent in the world. And we of course that isn't in some regards they've been trying to stop people from moving, but in fact when you look at, and there's been some really great, I think Brown University Institute of War Studies has looked at both the costs of war and the human displacement from the wars that the US has been engaged in since 2011. And the numbers are staggering. There's dozens of millions of people who have lost their homes or been uprooted directly because of some form of US intervention. Another number here that I think is important to keep in mind is that, yeah, just like how we are responding to this. So going back to this idea of climate change and how this is going to be probably the primary cause for people moving across international borders in coming decades. The United States has spent 11 times more in a recent 5-year period, I think going up to 2022, in border enforcement than in climate change mitigation. So if your actual incentive is, if your ultimate goal is to stop people from coming to the United States, which that's not my goal, obviously, you would do better to put that money towards climate change mitigation than stopping people at the border, because it doesn't work. And let's just play this out one more step. Let's say it did. Let's say borders were effective. What is the end game there? So let's look at a country like Haiti, where now we're deporting people back to Haiti. Or let's look at a country like Honduras that is being, in part devastated because of climate change, hurricanes, drought, rising seas, etc. Not to mention some other very serious issues pushing people to flee. Let's say you could wall them off. Would you want to immobilize a few million people, circle them off with a border wall and keep them in there like that? Like eventually that is going to become this political powder keg, and you're going to have a revolution, a complete war, and those people are going to, pardon the hydrological metaphor again, but those are going to spill over that border eventually. So like it just sort of so wrong-headed and short-sighted to think that this is going to be an effective solution at all. And again, thinking about solution as like offshoring a problem to Mexico or something, like as if that's going to solve a problem here, when it's just pushing the problem a little bit beyond your view for a minute, or a little bit more beyond your like political view for a minute.
Yeah, see, my reaction to this whole issue is just like yours. I grew up on the border. I lived almost half my life on the border, and I saw the deaths and the suffering of people, and that's what just really just motivates me when you see death and suffering of innocent people. That's a pretty strong sign that that's a bad government program.
Yeah.
But there's another factor here, and I don't want to diminish the human cost of this, but you have been so powerful on is the effect on animal life. And when I read your stuff about jaguars, and to me it's fascinating that how you're threatening the species with this wall because they can't cross, which is their natural thing. Would you just touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I have done some. I've really been, I don't know, honored to be able to do some great reporting, or get to do some great reporting on jaguars specifically, but it holds for a lot of other species. So jaguars are like the marquee species, the big name, the beautiful big cat. And the situation is that jaguars used to be prevalent in the Southwest United States. They in fact originally evolved here to be this sort of this slightly different cat than some of his ancestors. And then they, proliferated more in like the Sierra Madre and going down into South America. And in the, especially the late 19th century and then the past 100+ years, they've been effectively extirpated at the behest of ranchers and trophy hunters. So now that we have a wall, and there's been some conservation efforts south of the border, we have seen some jaguars start to meander back and get into Arizona again. Right now, there are likely 2 jaguars living in Arizona. There's only likely 2 jaguars at all in the United States. Like I said, most of Arizona is now walled off from Sonora. If we finish that wall, and the Biden administration has been filling in gaps, this is the administration that was promising not another foot of wall. They have been, I've, been out there at construction sites watching them put up more bollards. If they seal it off, jaguars will not be able to survive in the United States. Especially male jaguars need a lot of room to roam. They're not communal species. They're singular animals, and they need a lot of room to roam. And there are cascading effects for not having this apex predator in our ecosystem. It affects the ungulates, like the herbivores, like deer and others that are eating plants, and then if those plants are able to aren't able to grow because there's an overabundance of the ungulates, then and it's just like this is something that we saw like in Yellowstone with the wolves, where the population of elk got out of control and ate up all the spruce, and just like you see it just get all out of whack. And to think that we're not a part of that, to think that that doesn't affect us is so incredibly naive. And it also has been just one of the driving factors of how we've sort of thrust ourselves into this situation we're in now with these climate crises that we're seeing. And, like I said, like it's not just the jaguar, but there's a number of other animals that are seriously affected by the border wall, that we are sealing off this singular ecosystem, these interrelated sort of habitats, and that there is no natural barrier between them. And without having all of that space, a lot of the species are going to really suffer. And then again, that is going to play out, and we're going to see that, affect humans and other species and just kind of keep on rolling out. So it's, the effect of borders on the natural environment too is something that is often overlooked, or it's championed by like sort of the eco-fascists who say, "Oh, migrants are trashing the lands that they're crossing through." Well, I mean, they are leaving trash as they go because they're being hunted by people with guns, and they are not allowed to pass through ports of entry where they could do so in a much orderly way and throw their water bottle in the garbage can. Yes, that is true that they're leaving trash. And, a lot of people also are out there, activist organizations, and they pick up the trash and they try to recycle what they can. And so, yeah, it's just I don't know, sort of an extra pet peeve of mine that arguments gets thrown out a lot about migrants destroying the borderlands that they're walking through.
Well, I want to raise when you talked about not going back to that for that guy. There's somebody that's raised something about the Israel Gaza situation, but I don't want to go down that road here. But there's you mentioned about not going back to help that guy, but I'm sure you're familiar with that guy that the feds prosecuted in New Mexico for helping out immigrants, giving them water and food, and it's a
Yeah.
great case of jury nullification. The jury acquitted him, but that's the risk
Scott,
he ran. You were committing a felony if you went back and started
yeah,
transporting this guy.
yeah. Scott Warren, he was a friend of mine. He was in Arizona, and he was prosecuted for aiding and abetting. There was a hung jury, and the government decided to try him again, and they failed on the second try. There's another case that I think was pretty illuminating too that I reported on just a month or so ago. So a man from southern Mexico, from Chiapas, Mexico, was climbing the wall to get over into the U.S., and he was on the top of this 30-foot wall, and he fell off. He fell off on the south side, and snapped his ankle very badly. So his bone was actually sticking out of his skin, and he passed out. He doesn't know what happened to the group because he was out for, well, minutes, maybe longer, and he woke up and he was alone. He was actually on U.S. territory because the border wall is built on U.S. territory. It's not built exactly on the divide between the United States and Mexico, because Mexico wouldn't have agreed to that, and because construction crews just needed the space. So it's often either at least 6 feet and often more than that, actually north of the juridical line. So he was on U.S. territory, but on the south side of the wall, and there's no gaps anywhere nearby. The first people who spotted him were Border Patrol agents, and he called out to them. He was in excruciating pain. And there's a little bit of a differing to two sides of the story. Border Patrol says that they gave him water and they called Mexican authorities. He says they didn't give him anything and they just carried on. Regardless of exactly what happened in that first instant, the first moment when he was encountered by Border Patrol, he was on the south side of the wall for about 24 hours. Border Patrol then came back a few hours later with some activists. Some activists called an ambulance. Border Patrol stopped the ambulance from coming because they said that they couldn't get to him. The activists were asking Border Patrol to cut through the wall to give this man aid. The Border Patrol refused. It started raining. It got sunset. It was night again. So he was going on, yeah, at this point about 24 hours. Finally, the ambulance was called again, and the fire chief went out there and said, "This man is at risk of losing his foot or worse." And they cut through the wall, and well, first they splinted his leg through the wall and gave him an IV through the wall. And then when he was like, no one was coming and helping, they actually just cut through the wall. And Border Patrol, they could have done it 15 or so hours earlier. He was on U.S. soil at that time, and to me, like that vision of this lack of empathy, like I mentioned, Jacqueline Stevens says the border like stands as a limit for empathy, is just like so clearly expressed in this case. But yeah, I'm out there not infrequently and see people who are hot or cold or sick or kids. And I'm out there and I'll give them water if I have it. If I'm out there with some actors, there's often like crews out there, they'll give them water. And then we say bye and we drive home. And we can't even give them a ride to a border patrol station where they want to turn themselves in because we could get prosecuted.
Right.
And that weighs on you. I mean, I'll finish with one other story, but I was out earlier this year and it was winter, winter in Arizona. It was chilly and breezy and slightly raining. And we were out there driving with a crew of activists, just seeing what sort of camps that some of the migrants had built out there. And a family with a couple of young boys were just soaking wet. And the activist who was driving the car said, "Look, jump in the car. We're gonna drive you to the camp at least. Like we can't drive you to the road and the border patrol station, but we can drive you to the camp at least where there's a tarp and you can get under the rain, out of the rain." And the little boy, I think he was 6 or 7, I can't remember. Just like the lack of like sort of like, I don't know, personal boundaries that kids at that age have. He just jumped in my lap. I was sitting in the back seat. And like I recognized like immediately like how cold and wet he was. Like I started like basically sharing and like, what do you do with a freezing cold kid in your lap? You like, put your arms around him and grab him. And I was like getting soaked because he was like wearing 3 or 4 layers and they were just absolutely soaking wet. And we rode to this with place where there's this camp that like set up a couple like gas stoves and like some tarps. And he got out and sniffling and half sick, freezing wet, freezing cold and wet. And we left him because that's the only thing we could do. And we drove on. And like that, I feel like I can still feel the impression of his cold little body on mine. And like this is what we're forced to deal with. And this is like what we're forced to deny, the humanity we're forced to deny because of these forms of bordering. And it's just, I mean, this is the fact, this is the impact of how we are structuring the edges of our nations right now.
Okay, well, we've only got 2 minutes left, but there is one substantive question that popped up. Let me just ask you that. What is Mexico's responsibility to its neighbors as it regards asylum? Is Mexico not signatory to the same agreements in this matter as the U.S.?
It is signatory, so it did sign on to the original refugee agreement and the refugee convention, and then also to the 1967 protocol. So it has legal obligation to hear and weigh asylum claims. It does not have the capacity to do so. COMAR is the name of the agency in Mexico that fields asylum claims, and they have, I can't remember exactly what their funding is right now, but it is a pittance. I mean, just like a tiny sliver of what the US asylum processing system is, which is itself, extremely backlogged and underfunded. So, in effect, you applying for asylum, there's, hundreds of people, and that's it, who safely or successfully rather apply and gain asylum in Mexico. There's been efforts by the U.S. and international efforts to try to put more funding into Mexican asylum efforts, but it just not been functional really. And Guatemala has an asylum system as well, and the U.S. tried to use that as a reason for pushing people back into Guatemala, flying them back into Guatemala, and having their cases heard there. And I think that a single person this is like 2018, 2019, was able to achieve asylum. And I think there's 9 total cases that actually went through. So it's just not a viable option at this point.
Okay, we're out of time, and thank you, John. A great
Yeah.
presentation. Go and buy John's book, The Case for Open Borders, as well as your first book. What was your first book about asylum?
Yeah, about asylum, The
Yeah,
Dispossessed. Yeah.
Dispossessed. So thank you very much, and thank you all for tuning in. Next week, you're in for a little different twist next week with Ben Powell. Ben takes the what is called the Ellis Island approach to open borders, and so you're going to get a little bit of different angle on that. I guarantee you'll enjoy that one, just like I hope you've enjoyed this one. Thank you, John, and keep up the great work.
Thank you, Jacob. Appreciate it.